Meet the Mets, meet the Mets. Step right up and greet the Mets. Bring your kiddies, bring your wife. Guaranteed to have the time of your life, because the Mets are really socking the ball, knocking those home runs over the wall. East side, west side, everybody's coming down to meet the METS Mets of New York town. Oh, the butcher and the baker and the people on the streets, where do they go? To meet the Mets! Oh, they're hollering and cheering and they're jumping in their seats. Where do they go? To meet the Mets! All the fans are true to the orange and blue, so hurry up and come on down, 'cause we got ourselves a ball club, the Mets of New York town. Give 'em a yell, give 'em a hand, and let 'em know you're rooting in the stand. Come on and meet the Mets, meet the Mets. Step right up and greet the Mets. Bring your kiddies, bring your wife. Guaranteed to have the time of your life, because the Mets are really socking the ball, knocking those home runs over the wall. East side, west side, everybody's coming down to meet the METS Mets of New York town, of New York town.
What's up, Mets fans? Welcome back to Mets Talk Live right here on the channel. Hopefully, Mets fans, you are doing pretty damn good on this off day Monday, because our New York Mets won 3 out of 4 against the Philadelphia Phillies as they took care of business last night 2-1 with an excellent performance by Edwin Diaz going 2 innings. Everything is coming up roses for the New York Mets, but we do have a lot to talk about on this off day and on this show. So make sure you hit on that like button, guys. Let's bring more Mets fans to the chat, more to the stream. Let's talk about our New York Mets, and subscribe to the channel if you're not a subscriber as of yet. And guys, listen, this is probably almost the best case scenario going into the Atlanta series for the New York Mets, right? Go all the way back, circa 2022, right? Long time ago. Mets found themselves in a similar situation. Little different, but very similar situation, as they're fighting for their lives to win a division title, where the Braves are just clawing and coming back and basically right behind us, ready to take what should have been ours. Little different, understandable, but a very similar scenario. The second to last series of the year. Difference is the Mets weren't having a very good September in 2022. This time in 2024, the New York Mets are having an outstanding September, while the Braves basically coughed up a four-game lead from the Mets, right? They coughed it up. So we can say that we're piling down and coming down their neck, and we were coming after them, and we took it over well before this series has come about starting tomorrow. Our New York Mets have done the job up until this point. They needed to be, at the very least, going into that Atlanta series up a game. They found their way, taking 3 out of 4 against the Phillies to remain 2 games where they were to start the series against Philadelphia. Right? That was the concerning issue, because you did not want to go to Atlanta up a game going into that Atlanta series. You just did not want to do that, because then you really needed to take 2 out of 3. Because if you didn't and you lost 2 out of 3, now you're chasing them. And now a little different here, because it was basically determined in 2022 that if you didn't win the NL East, you were going to be the first wild card. That was determined, regardless if it was the Braves or the Mets. In this scenario, it's a little bit different, because it's not a death sentence for either team, by the way. Even if the Mets take 2 out of 3, it's not a death sentence for the Braves, even though it hurts them a lot, and it clinches the Mets a playoff berth. But if the Mets do lose 2 out of 3, they're still up a game going into the final 3 games of the season, and that's not including what Arizona does. Not a lot of people are bringing up Arizona as a fallback plan for both teams, by the way, not just the New York Mets. Right? We're not talking about that enough, because that can come into play for the New York Mets and the Atlanta Braves. Because if Arizona doesn't play well in their next series, starting today against San Francisco, the Mets and the Braves can gain a half a game by the end of tonight. By tomorrow, we could be talking about the Mets are up basically a game and a half because of the tiebreaker, and the Braves gain a half a game before even playing a game tomorrow between the Mets and the Braves. So there's a lot more to think about and to watch. And another scenario, in case things go sour for either team in this series, they have a backup plan, and that's the Arizona Diamondbacks, which both teams have the tiebreaker over the D-backs. So that's where we got to really talk about this series. We know the scenario for the New York Mets. Take 2 out of 3 against the Braves, you clinch a playoff berth. Now, seeding is still up in the air, because mathematically the Mets will have a chance at the first wild card. Obviously, are in the second wild card, and obviously the third wild card is in play as well. So they have a scenario where they can be the first wild card, because we're all looking at the same schedule. The last 3 games of the season, if the Mets are within a game or 2 of the San Diego Padres, and Arizona does beats the Padres up in the final series of the year, the Mets might have a chance of taking that first wild card. Now, I know that's a long shot. I know we're still down 3 games from the Padres, but there's 6 games to play, and we've seen the Mets in a week covered 4 games, as they were 4 games back at the Atlanta Braves about a couple of weeks ago. And within a week, they got back to being tied within a week. And it can happen that quickly, Mets fans. And that is why you have to worry and pay attention on all the scenarios when it comes to what could happen and what's the possibility of the New York Mets if they don't win this series. Now, at all costs for both of these teams. Now, again, we care about the Mets. We don't care about the Braves, right? We all know that. We all know that. And I'm sorry if I'm lagging a little bit. The Wi-Fi has been a little tricky, but I kind of got a new camera. I kind of got a new little setup here. So it's supposed to be clearer and hopefully better. We'll find out about that. I think it looks okay, but you guys tell me. Both teams need to avoid to get swept here. If the Mets get swept, well, you're going to be down a game in the final 3 games. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to make the playoffs. And that is the situation in the New York Mets scenario where we have to have that discussion. about the Arizona Diamondbacks. There was no backup plan in 2022. It was division or first wild card. We knew that scenario. Here, we don't know. This is not a death sentence. This is not, oh, we missed the playoffs if the Braves sweep the New York Mets. It's not. Because the Arizona Diamondbacks could lose 2 out of 3. They could not play well. And even in the case if they do play well, the Mets are a game behind, probably, if not tied with the Arizona Diamondbacks, and still have a chance of making the playoffs in a different scenario that doesn't involve the Braves. So, look, I put it up on X, and the New York Mets and the New York Mets fans have to exercise the demons. If you are at least in your early 30s or older, as you're watching right now, you know what I mean. You know what I'm talking about from the movie Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, when he said that to Lois Einhorn. You guys remember that if you're old enough. The Mets have to exercise the demons. Not only against those goddamn Atlanta Braves, but in Atlanta at Truist Park, as the Mets are 11 games under 500, 25-36 in Truist Park since it opened in 2017. So, and I know that went around X today. I'm not sure who put it. I think it was Chris, if I'm not mistaken. But I actually wanted to look it up to see if, trying to get the numbers correct. And I think Chris put it up there on X, if I'm not mistaken. And it started going around X when it came to retweeting and all that craziness as well. So they haven't played well in Truist Park. They've played a little bit better over the last few seasons than they did in the prior years. But it's been a horror show in that ballpark. The Mets just can't get over that hump. And similar to what 2022 kind of went down, or was going into that series as well, it was still the Mets have to get over this hump. Even though the Mets were having a great season, beating Atlanta would have been probably mentally satisfying for this New York Mets team. That means they would have won the division, and who knows what would have happened in the playoffs instead of getting bounced in the wildcard round against the San Diego Padres. Right? In this case scenario, I think it's very important to Mets fans and this Mets team that the core was a part of that 2022 team that kind of mentally checked out after they lost that. They got swept in Atlanta, regardless if they were already going to make the playoffs. This is more a mental aspect than a math aspect when it comes to the New York Mets. Because, as I've been saying, the Mets can get swept here and there's still a path to the playoffs. But how good would you feel if the Braves sweep us and the Mets do find a way to make the playoffs, whatever wildcard seed you want to talk about, but they make the playoffs? How confident going into that playoff round, whatever it might be, it's obviously going to be a wildcard round. Is it going to be at home as number one? Is it going to be on the road against San Diego, or is it going to be on the road against Milwaukee? That's yet to be determined. How confident will you be going into the playoffs knowing that your kryptonite, the Atlanta Braves in Truist Park, swept you a few days ago, and now you're starting a series? It seems like very similar outcomes from 2022, even though the Mets found a way to get into the playoffs. So they still overcame the Atlanta Braves. The Mets did not overcome 2022. Do I believe this team would check out if they get swept in Atlanta? No. I don't think the other guys, minus the core, will allow that to happen. But I think it's so much of a mental situation in this series, and I know Mets fans are feeling it. They've been talking about it on sports radio. Everybody who's calling up a WFAN, the hosts are talking about it. Fans on X are talking about it. We're talking about it in the stream. And I know other Mets content creators and their shows are going to be talking about it all day today if they haven't already. And I know there's a couple of shows. And before I get into it more, I just want to apologize to Anthony Subway to Shay. I do have to go to work. I did promise him to be on the show at 9 p.m. tonight. I couldn't do it, so I feel really bad, but life happens. And I told him early this morning just so he can prepare for me not being there. And I feel really bad, but Anthony, that's an apology live here. I do apologize for that. But what I think is more important is that would it be cool to celebrate on the field in Atlanta, clinching a postseason berth in Atlanta at Truist Park? Absolutely. That would be awesome. Right? That would be awesome. That would be fun. We'll all enjoy it. But I think it would be just a sigh of relief that the Mets finally did the job and finished the job by clinching a playoff berth. Now, this doesn't mean that Atlanta's out of the playoffs. Like, I think we were talking about the scenario a lot. That doesn't mean they're out of the playoffs because, again, Arizona comes into play. So we might see them in the playoffs if things work out that way. But I think it exercised the demons a little bit, beating Atlanta in Atlanta to clinch a playoff berth and the way the Mets wanted to do it. Because I think it's going to be a very big question mark if the Mets do not play well in Atlanta, but find their way into the playoffs by other teams not playing well or the Mets doing well against the Milwaukee Brewers and they make the playoffs. I still think there's going to be that question, damn, we can't beat the Braves. And is that going to remain in their head? Are they going to, check out again? Not most of the team, because it's a lot different team than it was in 2022. But the core guys that felt that in 2022, what is that going to do to them? And I think that's a big deal. And that's why I think the Mets need to take 2 out of 3 and clinch a playoff berth, because I don't want that question in their minds. Because I think this team is more, I would say, how can I say this in a nice way? This team, 2024, is more, I would say, they have that comeback to them, right? They have that bounce back that I don't think that 2022 team ever had, because they never felt adversity in that year until September, and it was too late. This year, we've seen a tremendous amount of bounce backs. 0-5 to start the season, 11 games back, bad losses in the 9th inning, grand slams to Carroll in Arizona, winning the first 2 in San Diego, then losing the last 2 before heading to Arizona. Right? Those are bad losses that, a lot of people thought the Mets were dead after those losses. And they bounced back. This team has a bounce back to them that I don't remember in my lifetime that this team had. Maybe it was 2015 where they never felt out of a ball game, where a lot of times in 2015, later in the year, they came back in ball games when they were down. But even the 2000 team that were so good, the 06 team that was very good, there wasn't a ton of adversity for those teams. 2015, there was a lot of adversity, right? Starting off basically being 500 before the trade deadline, having to win 2 out of 3, doing a good job in that Washington series prior to the deadline. There was a lot going on when the Mets acquired Cespedes. They had to exercise that Washington Nationals demon. As if you watched 5 Days in Flushing, you knew the team that tormented the Mets in those years was the Washington Nationals. They finally overcome that. This is the scenario that if there's a 5 Days in Flushing 2.0 for the New York Mets, it's going to be the Atlanta Braves of 2024. And if they can overcome that, I think it's a big mental hurdle that the Mets have overcome. And I think it would kind of keep them, it would give them a little bit of breather. It would calm them down. They could take a deep breath that they have overcome that demon that is the Atlanta Braves. The same way the 2015 Mets overcame the Washington Nationals in 2015. And I think that is so much more important. The mental aspect of beating the Braves in Atlanta, not because we can clinch a playoff berth. I think the Mets could still do that regardless if they lose 2 out of 3 in Atlanta. Even if they get swept in Atlanta, there's a scenario where the Mets can still make the playoffs, depending on what Arizona does. But I think having that mental hurdle and overcoming it is more important than even clinching it in Atlanta, right? Look, it would be the best of both worlds. The Mets get over that hump. They exercise the demons of the Atlanta Braves in Truist Park, and they clinch a playoff berth. It all comes together in all one big happy moment. But the bigger moment and the most important moment, in my opinion, is beating the Atlanta Braves at least 2 out of 3. Because the Alonsos, the Nimos, even the Lindors, and if you want to keep on going with other guys, we can. Alonso, all those guys, they can all breathe a sigh of relief that they took care of business when it mattered the most. When a team like the Atlanta Braves are trailing you, and make no mistake about it, the Atlanta Braves are probably talking about a sweep in-house because that is their best case scenario. 2 out of 3 doesn't really help them out except for the tiebreaker because the Mets will still have a 1-game lead going into the final 3 games of the season. So they're going to be talking about a sweep. The broadcast for the Atlanta Braves are going to be talking about a sweep. And I'm a nutcase. I like to listen to sports talk in Atlanta just to see what the hell they're talking about. Yeah, they're talking about Georgia football and blah, 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 and all that nonsense. But when it came to the topic of the Atlanta Braves, you heard the radio host talking about their fishing for a sweep. The fans that are calling up are talking about they need to get a sweep. They want to get a sweep. So the talk of Atlanta is they're going into the series looking for a sweep. Now, they don't have to overcome that mental hurdle because they've owned us, and we all know it. They put us over a barrel many times in my lifetime, in your lifetime, and even if you're a young kid in your recent lifetime. The fact of the matter is the Braves don't have pressure on them. They have a World Series title. They have a similar team that's going to be showing up next year. They've had this team for the last couple of seasons since the World Series title that they won in 2021. Right? So they continue to not have to worry about overcoming anything because if they don't make the playoffs this year, they're coming back with a very similar team, especially their position players. The New York Mets, on the other hand, their core could finally be broken up after this core has felt the postseason one time out of their 6 seasons as a New York Met prior to their free agency periods. Now Alonso has come up. So this can be a very different team next year if the Mets don't make the playoffs. So it's going to be very interesting. And look, I'm excited. These games are obviously important, right? I'd rather be in a pennant race than playing out the string and not caring about the games and talking about the offseason, talking about sign-ins, talking about trades and all that nonsense and how to get better in 2025. I don't care about that right now. I care about game 157 in Truist Park against Atlanta with Luis Severino on the mound against Schwellenbach. That's what I care about. And let me check the comments really quick, guys, as we continue to talk about this Brave series. Yeah, I know people are talking about who they want in the playoffs. Listen, I don't care about revenge, even though it would be sweet to play the Padres and beat them in their home ballpark, as they did us a couple of years ago. I think the Mets can beat anybody. as that's been proven as one of the best teams in baseball, the Philadelphia Phillies, the Mets just took 2 out of 3 out of 4. And you see the Mets can beat anybody. The Mets can beat anybody. In the playoffs, anybody can beat anybody. As we've seen the last couple of seasons. The Phillies, third wild card 2022. The Diamondbacks, third wild card of last year. So going into the playoffs, you can beat anybody. Anybody can beat anybody. The Detroit Tigers, who are tied for a playoffs with Kansas City, can beat anybody. But I don't think we should make that a priority of who would you rather face. Because you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment. To be quite honest. And this is not, disagreeing with your comment at all. It's just that I don't think we should concern ourselves on who we're playing because we can play. Let me see. We can play Milwaukee. We could play San Diego, right? That's what will happen. Unless the Mets get the first wild card and then they play the second wild card team. So as of right now, if things hold up, the Mets are either going to play San Diego or Milwaukee. Obviously, both away. So Milwaukee, see, people would rather play San Diego probably because of more of the revenge factor than they've been one of the hottest teams in baseball. Because I don't care who you play. I'm always concerned going into the playoffs because anybody can beat anybody. So if you don't pitch well, there's no coming back. And trying to catch up most of the time. Most of the time, you're going to be behind in the series. Now you really need to win that game. It's especially the division series when it's best out of 5. It's crazy. And the wild card is obviously 3 games. It's best out of 3. So if you lose game 1, now you got to win the next 2. So I'm not concerning myself for who we're going to play, right? We can talk about that once we clinch a playoff berth. And then we can see the scenarios playing out. Because there's a lot of scenarios that can still happen. The Mets take over the number 1 wild card and the Braves, win some games here in there. If the Mets beat the Braves 2 out of 3 and say the Braves win 4 out of 6 and they pass Arizona and maybe the Mets pass San Diego somehow. Well, the Mets could be playing the Braves in the wild card series at home. Like, there's a lot of scenarios that can still happen based on what happens because there's 4 teams fighting for 3 spots. And just because the San Diego Padres are up 3 games, they also play Arizona at the end of the season. So those games can really matter. That can bounce Arizona out of the playoffs. That can bounce San Diego out of the playoffs. Even though that's an unlikely scenario, it's still a possibility. Ichiro, true. I understand we must take game 1 to set the series, and I agree with that. I think any series you play, game 1 is always crucial because you don't want to go into game 2 knowing you have to win to at least have a chance of winning the series. But again, we're talking about this series differently than we talked about 2022, right? 2022, the Mets were spiraling out of control very slowly as the Braves were ascending and we were descending. Here, the Braves have been playing, I would say solid, not great, but solid. The Mets have been playing very good in the month of September. The difference is there's other ways to the playoffs for the Mets in 2024 than in 2022. It felt like it was a mental situation when it came to the Mets. That if they didn't win the division, they weren't going to be happy to make the playoffs. That was such a bad job by the organization, by the manager, Buck Showalter, and the players. They felt sorry for themselves and wanted everybody to feel sorry for them because they didn't win the division. Yet, they should have been excited to make the playoffs and get in and perform. I don't think this team is going to hide, behind the tree if they don't play well in Atlanta. I don't think so. Now, Mets fans might panic because it's still in our heads that we can't beat the Braves and we can't get over that hump. And then we're going to question, even if the Mets make the playoffs, are they even good enough to win? Are they even good enough to win a series, win a round? That's where it's going to go in the Mets fans' minds. I think this team has bounced back enough for bad losses and bad series all season that we should give them the benefit of the doubt if they lose a series, because the Mets can play well, and I think we lose focus on this. The Mets can play well in this series and still lose 2 out of 3, right? If the Mets in the Phillies series, if they would have split, would anybody would have said the Mets played bad in this series? No. If the Mets would have lost 3 out of 4 and they played the same way, I would think a lot of us would have thought that the Mets played well in the series. Certain moments cost you games, which every game has a moment that costs other teams losses. But I don't think this team is going to bury themselves bury their heads in the ground if they lose this series to the Braves, even if they get swept. It would be disappointing. I'd worry about the core guys because they've been there, done that before. But I don't think this team, who's bounced back in all aspects of situations where you think they were dead and they bounced back. So I'm not saying that that's going to be the case, but I just think that it's a lot different in 2022. So because technically the division was never really a scenario, and they basically been fighting for their lives to get a wild card berth. And I think that's what we have to understand when it comes to the Mets. Sorry, my hat's all crazy right now. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Hector, I agree with you that this is not moral victories, but I'm not talking about moral victories. I'm talking about the fact that there's still a way into the playoffs, which is the ultimate goal. Regardless of how we get there in these last 6 games, the goal is to get to the playoffs, and then anything can happen. We all understand that. Or at least most of us do. Right? This isn't moral victories at all. But we all understand, and going into this series, for Met fans, it's a mental hurdle, even for this core team, this core on this team. Right? And I said this, I don't know if you heard, Hector, but I said, this is an exercise the demon type of series for the New York Mets. If they do their job, win 2 out of 3, they clinch a playoff berth, they exercise the demons of beating Atlanta when it mattered the most, and it was at Truist Park, you take all that, and that's a win-win scenario because you clinch a playoff berth, you fight off those demons finally, and you can go into the Milwaukee series still playing for certain seedings, unless things work out where you kind of know where you're at in that spot. But there still might be seedings in the wild card situation where the Mets could be the 3rd, 2nd, or 1st wild card, depending on where it is the last 3 games of the season. So it's important, I think, mentally all around, that I think people should. I think for Mets fans, we all know Mets fans will panic, or at least most of them will panic if the Mets lose 2 out of 3, even though they'll be up a game going into the final 3 games of the series of the regular season. Right? Depending on what Arizona does, it might be golden for the Mets and the Braves for that matter. But again, we don't know. We can't predict the future. But I agree. I agree, Hector. I don't care how we do it. It's just that because the Braves are next, everybody's just like, you got to take 2 out of 3. Like, it's not a death sentence. And I think we're too many people are talking about it like it's a death sentence. Would it suck? Yeah. But you're still going to have a 1-game lead going into the final 3 games of the year. Now, the Mets still have a path if they get swept to make the playoffs based on what Arizona does and based on what the final 3 games of the season, what the Mets do in them final 3 games. We don't want that scenario, but there's still a path. So I think it's a mental hurdle this core players need to get over, and the Mets fans need to get over. I think they need this badly. Now, I don't think like I don't think of it like that because I'm more focused on how we get to the playoffs. Or, do we get to the playoffs? I don't care how we do it. If we get swept by the Braves and sweep the Brewers and we have no problem getting into the playoffs, I don't care how it goes. And you can have the argument of who you want to play. I still don't care. I think you play who you play, and if you play well, you're probably going to win. It's the playoffs. Anything happens. Oh, no, Hector, I'm not saying that I want to take 2 out of 3. Obviously, I want to take 2 out of 3 so I can go into the final 3 games of the season with my feet up. And just, we can have a conversation about seedings and who we're playing, but I don't care. But another factor that I know people are talking about is the weather. That hurricane that's in the Gulf of Mexico that's going to be, storming to Georgia, excuse me, is an issue. Because it looks like tomorrow is going to be perfectly fine. Wednesday, I would say, is looking a little bit better day by day, but Thursday looks like a wash. Now, weather changes quickly. We know that. But worst case scenario is that if that game gets postponed, Major League Baseball is going to make September 30th, which is supposed to be an off day for the Mets, be played on that day. Because I'm telling you right now, until the game starts, it's the Braves' decision. Because MLB probably already came to them. They probably already spoke to Braves upper management and Mets upper management about the weather. They already talked about this. The Braves don't want a doubleheader. That doesn't benefit them. It probably benefits the Mets a little bit more because if they clinch, they can rest some guys in the final 3 or 4 games of the season. What the Mets don't want, or any team for that matter, is that makeup game on the supposed off day prior to the wild card series. The day before, which will probably be an afternoon game, probably like a 2-3 o'clock game. That makeup game will be played on September 30th. We've seen it a couple of times already. That would be a worst case scenario. If that game is needed, you clearly got to pitch your best pitcher that'll be available. You can't worry about setting your rotation up for the playoffs because you might not make it. You have to do everything you can to win that ball game. And that's a scenario I just don't want. Because you're not having no off day. You're going into this series probably not pitching your best pitcher in your first game, even though we got a couple of guys that would throw out there on any moment because Severino should be available for game 1 of a wild card series, the way it's setting up. But if September 30th comes around and the Mets have to play an off-day game, that's going to matter. Now, remember, the Mets might still have to play that game if the Braves need that game or if Arizona needs that game. Just because the Mets might not need that game, they're still going to have to play. Now, the Mets can rest everybody and just play random people, but still, you want the whole team to get a rest before heading to wherever. Now, the best case scenario is that, well, not really, because you would have to play that game in Atlanta. So you would have to travel. What would suck if you would have to travel from Milwaukee when the season ends to go play one game in Atlanta and then travel back to Milwaukee again. Like that's a shitty scenario, right? But I don't want to have a situation where the Mets need that game on September 30th on the official off day of Major League Baseball before the wild card series begins on October 1st. I don't want the Mets to have that game mean something. Because if the Mets are in, they still might have to play that game. Nobody's talking about that either. If the Mets have to play that game because Atlanta or Arizona if Atlanta needs to win or Arizona needs the Braves to lose, That game is being played. Now, obviously, you're going to, if the Mets were smart, they would just bring up a lot of minor leaguers and just let them play. Right? Bring out Terrens, bring up a couple of young kids, do a whole crazy roster switch in one day to play a lot of minor leaguers, to sit guys. They can do that. But damn, I don't want to deal with that. And then we come to the Francisco Lindor situation. His comments from his little post-game interview yesterday, where he's optimistic, but says he's probably not going to be pain-free for the rest of the year. No guarantee he's going to be a part of this series, as he missed basically all 7 home games. And the Mets won 61 in that time, actually, at home. Great homestand. We don't know, and this is what I talked about, because even though there's no major damage of that back, if you've had back surgery, if you had back injuries, even if they're minor, they flare up at any moment. Has anybody had a back issue and bent down to pick something up, and then you get halfway and you're like, uh-oh? Just imagine playing professional baseball. I know very, very well, as I've had many back issues and back surgeries. I know. So I wake up every day hoping my back doesn't hurt. I know there's ways to get around it and probably shoot his ass up with cortisone, and that might work. But that's if they hit the right spot and all that craziness. And lower backs, you might feel it in your left side. You might wake up the next morning, they might be on the right side. So look, it's a fucked up scenario. We all want Francisco Lindor back tomorrow. He would obviously help this team tremendously. I mean, this guy has been MVP caliber. But Acuna has stepped up. Now, I'm going to ask you this question. And I think Hector probably heard it, or some of you might have heard it on WFAN when Evan Roberts was talking about it. He says, would you want a 70% Francisco Lindor playing shortstop? Or would you want 100% Luisangel Acuna playing shortstop, who's played very well? That's a tough question and a tough decision that Mendoza has to make, right? Do I play my 70% MVP candidate, or a kid that's shown he can play in the big leagues and play my shortstop? While technically Lindor could play, but you're not going to get 100% Francisco Lindor. Or do you rest Lindor, risking that maybe Acuna goes through a little bad spell and the Mets might start losing a little bit, and the postseason might be in jeopardy? That's a tough decision for Mendoza, because we all know Francisco Lindor is going to want to play. But Mendoza has to make the smart decision, not only for the team, but for Lindor as well. Because if you make the playoffs and Lindor plays these games, but kind of tweaks the back, and then you got to be dealing with that on the postseason roster. Because remember, guys, just so everybody knows, if Lindor comes out with an injury during the postseason, the wild card series, and you got to replace him on the wild card series, because you're not going to leave yourself one guy down, losing a roster spot in a wild card series when you might need that spot. You're not playing with a man down. You're going to replace that roster spot with somebody who's healthy. If you take Lindor off that wild card roster because he's hurt and can't play, because you're not going to leave Lindor on the roster not being able to play, he won't be eligible to be on the postseason roster in the next round. That's a rule. That's a rule. He's not eligible to be on the postseason roster the next round if you make it. So that's another scenario that you have to watch out for. So Mendoza is between a rock and a hard place here. This is not an easy decision for Mendoza. Regardless, if the doctors clear Lindor, We know that back is going to be painful for Lindor. But what's going to happen if Lindor gets the okay and he plays tomorrow and the back flares up like it did in Philadelphia, where he said it tightened up, he can barely walk? What do you do? That's why, in my opinion, Dylan, you're not going to DFA Martinez. If anybody says DFA Martinez, you're just not understanding how important JD Martinez could be in these last couple of series and in the postseason. I know he's struggled tremendously, but this is a guy, and yes, it's back then, and I know history usually doesn't matter, but I feel like JD Martinez, the veteran he is, I think he's going to figure it out at some point. And you can't just take JD out of there. Because exactly, House. JD Martinez can turn it on at any moment. And that's a guy, and that's a bat that I want in the postseason. Now, it might come to that based on a Lindor situation. But remember, the person you take off the roster is not eligible to be on the roster in the next round. So this is where Lindor's situation is very questionable and it's a very hard decision for Mendoza, because you want Lindor out there. He gives you supposedly gives you a better chance to win ball games, but the Mets have played outstanding with Luisson Acuna filling in. Now, in my case, I would just leave Lindor. If he's okay to play, I'd rather him come off the bench in a big spot to hit rather than playing him 9 innings and hopefully getting him through the game. Maybe DH him, because at least in that scenario, you can pinch hit and you're not really losing a roster spot, because if you were pinch hit for Lindor for whoever's the DH, you're not really losing that roster spot anyway. So there's a lot to look at here. But the weather is going to be a problem. We hope it doesn't, but it might. Thursday looks like a wash. Now, the best case scenario is that nobody needs that game at the end of the season and nobody has to play on September 30th on the official MLB off day before the wildcard series on October 1st. But I want to make this clear to Met fans who just think that if the Mets need that game, they got to play. No, no, no. If the Braves or the Diamondbacks need that game to be played, if the Diamondbacks need the Braves to lose or the Braves need to win to make it, the Mets have to travel to Atlanta after the Milwaukee series for the last series of the year for one game. Now, you can rest as many guys as you want, but you're going to have to play somebody. Now, you might play these guys 3 or 4 innings and let somebody else play another 4 innings or whatever. But you don't want to have a scenario where the Mets need that game. Because if Arizona or the Braves need that to be a win or a loss, the Mets can finagle. Mendoza can play who they want for a couple of minutes, put somebody else in. You can protect the guys as much as possible. But that's going to be a fascinating situation. They're not playing a doubleheader. Remember, the Braves have the final decision before the game starts. They have the decision today, tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday. It doesn't matter. When the game starts, it's MLB decision. When the game hasn't started yet, the Braves have the final say. The Braves don't want to play a doubleheader. That's hurting them for their final series of the year against Kansas City if they need those games. Which, looking like no matter what scenario, the Braves can't clinch a playoff berth by sweeping the Mets. So they're going to need to play those games and win at least 1, 2, possibly 3 games against Kansas City at the end of the year. So the Braves don't want to pitch sail tomorrow's for a doubleheader when the weather looks good, because that takes them out of the situation if they need them to play on 162 or possibly game 1 on September 30th. That's the issue. So, to finish up the stream, we got 3 games to play against Atlanta. The Mets are up 2 games. They're officially leading the second wild card based on tiebreaker. Remember, we're technically up a game on the Arizona Diamondbacks. Technically, which people aren't also talking about, the Mets are only 2 back of the San Diego Padres. Just because it's 3-0 loss, we also have the tiebreaker against the San Diego Padres. So it's only a 2 game. The Mets only have to tie the Padres to get that number 1 wild card spot. So it's a 2 game lead. So if the Mets are a game behind, if there's similar losses, if there's similar record, the Mets have the tiebreaker. So technically it is 3 games. But that scenario is also possible. But the Mets have 3 games against Atlanta in Truist Park. The weather looks like it's going to be an issue on the 3rd game, possibly the 2nd game, but it's looking better and better by the time goes on. It's like 60% chance they'll find a way to get that game in. Thursday is going to be crazy because the Braves can postpone it early. The Braves can say, listen, we're not playing. And that's going to be interesting. But the Mets did their job on the homestand, the final homestand of the regular season. 6-1, 3 out of 4 against Philly, 87 wins to 69 losses, 5 games out of a division, 3 out of a first wild card. In the second wild card, basically a game up, 2 in front of the Atlanta Braves. The New York Mets have their playoff berth in their hands. All they got to do is win. Severino against Schwellenbach, Peterson against Sale, Manaea against Fried. This won't determine the playoffs unless the Mets win. Then we know the Mets clinch. And that's a scenario where the Mets would clinch a playoff berth. Which wild card seed, who knows? But the only scenario that we know, if the Mets win 2 out of 3, they clinch a playoff berth. The Mets can lose 2 out of 3, be a game up going to the final 3 of the season. They can get swept, being down a game, and they still have an opportunity of making the playoffs. So, one scenario we know of. Mets take 2 out of 3, they're going to clinch a playoff berth. So, tomorrow starts game 1. The nerves will be starting definitely tomorrow. I know as soon as I wake up, as soon as I get home from work around 11 a.m., 12 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm going to start thinking about it. We're doing pre and post, me and Chris. We're ready to go. We're going to be nervous. The goosebumps. I can't wait for the game, 7:20. Ready to play. Ready to go. This is what we want. We want meaningful games. We got them. And my God, are they important. With that said, guys, thank you for tuning into a Mets Talk Live show on the channel Talking Mets with Rob. If you're a new subscriber of the channel, how are you? If you're somebody who never seen the channel before and is watching this stream and thinking about subscribing, please do. Hit on that like button. We got pre and post the rest of the season. Hopefully the roundtable, unfortunately, I can't do it because of work. I apologize to the group chat and the guys that do the roundtable. That's on me. Shit happens. Life happens. I wanted to do 3 shows today. I wanted to do this show. I wanted to do the show with Anthony on Subway to Shea. And I wanted to do a roundtable because the off day is the best day to do as many shows as possible and have everybody's thoughts and opinions there. Unfortunately, I couldn't do it. That's on me, nobody else. So my fault. But I do appreciate everybody tuning into Mets Talk Live. 3 games against the Braves, 3 games against the Brewers. Mets are up 2 games on the Atlanta Braves going into Atlanta. What will it be? And I see the poll. Met fans are very confident, at least in this poll, taking 2 out of 3 against the Atlanta Braves. You got your best pitchers going in Severino, Peterson, Manaea. Can't ask for any better pitching. Very similar scenario to 2022, but your best pitchers were going. The Mets didn't take care of business then. I believe this is a different team. I believe this team can do it. They've proven it. But the job's not done. With that said, guys, everybody, have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your off day before all the craziness starts back tomorrow on Tuesday in Atlanta. Mets Braves, game 157. Let's see how it goes, guys. Have a great night. Let's go Mets, and I'll see you next time, guys. Have a great night, and see you tomorrow for pre and pros with my man CP. Have a good night, guys. Let's
Welcome to Talkin' Mets with Rob. Subscribe to the channel for all your New York Mets in-game live, pre-game, post-game, round-table podcast, and all the breaking news for our New York Mets. Enjoy the show and let's go Mets.
Meet the Mets, meet the Mets. Step right up and greet the Mets. Bring your kiddies, bring your wife. Guaranteed to have the time of your life because the Mets